Hello everyone, I hope you're all well and welcome if you are new to my channel. Today I wanted to share a little bit about a recent day trip I took to London, which ended up becoming obviously a love letter to the city, as all of my kind of London content is, but also a love letter to Virginia Woolf. I really wanted to share my clips with you because it felt like the perfect day. There is a quote from Virginia Woolf, and it's one of those quotes that I can't find where it's from, but it's attributed to Virginia Woolf. I think it might be in her essays, but I'm not 100% sure, so don't fact check me on this one. But there's a quote which says, to walk alone in London is the greatest rest. And I didn't realise how much I needed this day in London by myself, walking around the city. I go to London pretty regularly for work things or like family things, but I've never really afforded myself the luxury of time just walking, which obviously is what I used to do like every weekend. And in fact, going back to the Virginia Woolf's work as well, in her writing, like in Mrs Dalloway, and I guess in actual Street Haunting as well, you have this idea of wanting to go to London, into the city, just to walk around for kind of the sake of it. It's kind of like Mrs Dalloway goes out to buy the flowers. She probably doesn't really need to go and buy the flowers herself, but she wants to because she wants to go out and walk around the city to become Clarissa, not just Mrs Dalloway. And I guess in Street Haunting there's Virginia Woolf going off to buy a pencil, and you know, the pencil is an excuse really to go and wander around London in the winter and just spend some time alone in the city. And I feel like this is what this was. My only thing I wanted to do was to go and visit a Virginia Woolf plaque, which I guess would make sense as to why this whole day trip turned into a bit of a Virginia Woolf exploration. But it really wasn't supposed to be that way. And I guess I have followed, you know, Virginia Woolf's suit in kind of being a flaneur in the city, just walking around and witnessing life and love and this moment in June, even though it's not June. But yeah, I just have really loved the day trip. So the blue plaque that I wanted to go and visit was the one that is on 29 Fitzroy Square. One of the things that will annoy me forever is that despite having lived in London for like 7 years, I only ever saw her blue plaque, which is in Gordon Square in Bloomsbury. And I think that's partly because I was always in that area of town, and so I spent a lot of time in Gordon Square, and in fact, yeah, almost like every weekend I would be in that square. So of course this is where this actual day started for me, but I'd never gone to 29 Fitzroy Square, and you know, I haven't even visited the one in Richmond either, despite going to Richmond quite a few times, and so I feel like I need to go back again. But this trip was all about going to see the blue plaque in Fitzroy Square, even though the only thing really, apart from seeing Ben's dad for coffee, that I wanted to do in London was go and see a new to me Virginia Woolf plaque. I never intended this video to be about Virginia Woolf, and I feel like I'm going to say Virginia Woolf a lot during this video, but it is about her now. But because I didn't intend it to be, I will put some little chapters because there are a few things I want to discuss, including my new Kindle, and of course I went book shopping, so there's a haul at the end, but I also want to talk about the novel The Years by Virginia Woolf, which is the novel I'm reading in this video, and then from reading that in a square in Bloomsbury it all spiralled, and this video is now what it is. I filmed this video also myself, but on my iPhone, and it does mean that there are a few times when I'm trying to film myself where you can see that I don't know how to point to things. If I'm allowed to speak positively about myself for one moment, when I was watching it back, I was like the excitement and wonder of a child. Like, I could just see in my face, and I will insert the clip, I was so happy to be home, I love London, and I'm very glad that we don't live there full time for many reasons now, but it will always be a really important part of my life and a significant chapter where so many of my kind of bigger life events happened and my life started in many ways. Well, the next chapter of my life started in London, and now I'm just on to the next chapter. Before I show you all of the clips, I really quickly wanted to talk about my Kindle because I've never talked about my love of reading on an e-reader before, but it's actually I love audiobooks too, but actually I love reading on a Kindle or on any e-reader device, but I've always had a Kindle, so I've got so many Kindle books. We can discuss that whole thing a different day. But I decided to update my Kindle because my Kindle was really, really old. I've had it, I think, not since university, but since, yeah, maybe when I first moved to London. And so I thought it was finally time for me to upgrade. And I got just like the basic one. I also got ads because anything I can do to save money, I'm there for. But I got the one in Matcha and I loved it. And so when I had this day in London, the only thing I wanted to do was just sit in parks and read. And again, I was reading the years on this. And then I often read books on my Kindle. Sometimes I'll get them very, very cheap. I love a 99p deal. And I then kind of, if I love the book, then I'll go and buy like a nice edition of it. That is a lot of what my books, like my bookcase is really, is me doing that. But I love it. But I am going to link this Virginia Woolf. Of course, I was reading Virginia Woolf on it. In case anyone is interested, I'm currently reading The Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie because I'm about to go and see the play. And I obviously want to know who did it before I go and see it. But this is linked to Virginia Woolf, I promise. Because with, at the moment, with my case, I've currently got the plastic case I had on before. And then I decided to actually put my wedding confetti in it. Which I actually think looks really pretty just for the meantime, because I always kind of just like a clear plastic case. And then my mum, at the same time as I made a different order that I'm going to show you, my mum made this really cute just like fabric case for it, which actually has been really useful because unfortunately I left this out for a moment and Branwell has actually bitten, not on the edges, on the actual corner of the screen. And you can't really tell it, but anyway, I cried about it because just kittens. And you know when it's like, I know I should have been more careful, but you just don't think they'll bite the actual screen. Anyway, it is absolutely beautiful. My mum felt that the pattern, because she had these flat quarters for a while, and then as soon as she realised I'd gotten the Matcha Kindle, of course I'm going to get a Matcha Kindle, I love matcha, she had to make me one with this pattern, and it just goes so beautifully together. On the day that this case arrived, the case that I'd ordered from a company called Clever Case, who all of their cases are bound following traditions of book binding, and I ordered this case, a Mrs Dalloway case, and this was one of their personalised ones. So what I'll do with it, the magnetic thing is so strong, so I'm holding it open because I'm like a weakling. It's a rubber case and I'll put it on the back of my clear case, but I think for now I might actually save this for a bit later because my mum's just sent me her case. But this is so beautiful and it is a personalised case. So I asked them, like, this is not one they normally do, and I said, is there any way you can get this edition, the Vanessa Bell, the original cover of Mrs Dalloway? And they went above and beyond to find me a good enough quality picture to actually be able to use, because there aren't that many, and I just absolutely love her. Before I leave you to the more cosy bookish parts of this video, I wanted also to go back to 29 Fitzroy Square because I realised I never actually explained more about it. Virginia Woolf lived there from 1907 to 1911, and it's where she kind of went to then go and marry Leonard Woolf. And there's a few reasons I wanted to visit it. Partly because I feel like it's the overlooked Virginia Woolf house. I think so much of the focus is on, obviously, Gordon Square in Bloomsbury and also the printing press in Richmond. But I wanted to kind of talk about it because there's a letter that she writes in 1909 to Duncan Grant. And even though the note in the letter isn't just about Fitzroy Square, it's also about her future life and her inhabiting rooms of one's own. But I think it is one of the first, not necessarily the first references, but it is, I think, quite a significant reference when she's at 29 Fitzroy Square. So I'll read you that quote now. Good God, to have a room of one's own with a real fire and books and tea and company and no dinner bells and distractions, a little time for doing something. It's a wonderful vision and surely worth some risks. On that note, I think it's time for us to head into the city. It was an uncertain spring, the weather perpetually changing, sent clouds of blue and of purple flying over the land. In the country, farmers looking at the fields were apprehensive. In London, umbrellas were opened and then shut by people looking up at the sky. But in April, such weather was to be expected. freewheeling like the rays of a searchlight. The days, the weeks, the years passed one after another across the sky. She heard the sparrows chirp quicker and quicker. She heard wheels in the distance sound louder and louder. Life came closer and closer. I hope you enjoyed seeing clips of my journey across London, even though I didn't go that far. I started up at King's Cross and I came down into Bloomsbury and then went to Gordon Square, then worked my way obviously just round the corner to Gower Street Waterstones, which are my favourite. I then kind of went across to Fitzroy Square, and then from Fitzroy Square I kind of went across to Marylebone, and went to Daunt Books, which I've decided controversially I don't like. It's just way too busy. It wasn't a pleasant shopping experience, and I love when bookshops are busy because it means people are in there buying books, and that's the greatest thing. But as a shopper, as someone who wants to look at books there, it was really uncomfortable. So I don't think I'll be going again, because even though it's beautiful, it doesn't feel nice as a shopper. It's like a tourist attraction, which is great that a bookshop is a tourist attraction, but it's not for me. I think it's gotten so much busier than I remember it being when I first moved. But anyway, it's a different conversation for a different day. From Daunt Books, I went up to Regent's Park and did a little bit of a circle around Regent's Park, but not the full thing. I kind of actually just sat and read for a long time, and also obsessed over one pigeon in a blossom tree. I've stayed looking at this pigeon for like 10 minutes. So even though there's a few clips of this pigeon, me and this pigeon were like this by the end of it. And then I went around Regent's Park and then got on the tube at Regent's Park down to meet Ben's dad in Charing Cross. But I didn't really film anything. In fact, I did. I filmed Ben's dad because he brought a gingerbread man. He got a coffee and a gingerbread man, which is exactly what Ben would have picked up if he was with me in Pratt. And I thought that's very cute. So I did have a tiny clip of Ben's dad's hands, I think, holding, but I probably didn't. I'll put that in now because I probably didn't include it in my actual thing. And then after that, I just walked along to Leicester Square and then got the tube back to King's Cross to be in York again. And then actually on my way back from York, there was like a beautiful, like the sun was setting over the river, and so it was a beautiful day. So in a very Mrs Dalloway fashion, I had my own kind of walk across London. And thinking of Mrs Dalloway, actually, one thing I do want to mention is that this year on the 14th of May is the 100th anniversary of the publication date of Mrs Dalloway, and so I'm going to be hosting a reading celebration on here, basically encouraging people to read Mrs Dalloway. So on the May 14th I'm going to be hosting a Mrs Dalloway's party, which is just going to be a little bit of a moment on my channel and on social media. So if you'd like to join, please let me know. But now I'll get into the books that I bought on my journey. The perfect place to start is of course Mrs Dalloway's Party. This is a collection of short stories, and it includes obviously Mrs Dalloway's Party, which famously begins with Mrs Dalloway said she would buy the gloves herself. So what could have been is really in that short story, or in that kind of draft of the novel. But there are also other stories where the characters of Miss Dalloway appear. So it's kind of like a mosaic in a way, where it all kind of fits together and I guess builds out the world of the Dalloways, but you don't need to read them in order to understand Mrs Dalloway. The focus is on Virginia Woolf's kind of, I guess, preoccupation with parties and lots of novels, and also obviously Mrs Dalloway. And so I think on Mrs Dalloway's Party, on the day in May 14th, I'm going to be reading this and talking about it a little bit more. But I read Mrs Dalloway's Party and I think The New Dress when I was studying for my dissertation on Mrs Dalloway, but I haven't read any of the other ones, so I'm really excited to read the full collection. The next two books I bought are mainly just me judging a book by its cover, which is something I do, but also as working in publishing and seeing how many conversations has to happen before a book gets approved by even the team, even before the author. I feel like judging a book with a cover is absolutely fine, and it should be that way in all the pain that goes into it. But anyway, these are two books by Virginia Woolf that I will probably read on my Kindle, but I have actually really wanted these copies for a long time. These are the vintage classics copies, but they have these really stunning jackets that I actually haven't been able to find online or even in bookshops for whatever reason. I think they're just kind of older, and all of my original Mrs Dalloway copies that I had were in this series, and so I just kind of wanted them for nostalgia, because when I first got into Virginia Woolf, I remember especially this, I should actually say what they are, This is Night and Day, and this is Virginia Woolf's first novel, The Voyage Out, which I remember when I first started dating Ben. I remember going to his house and him having Mrs Dalloway on his bedside table, and I think it was to impress me, let's be real. But yeah, so I remember wanting, when I was really getting into Virginia Woolf, I really wanted these editions and I just haven't been able to find them, and so when I saw them I had to have them. And I really like vintage classics, and you can see just behind me or down here I've got quite a few, but I'm still wanting to expand my collection because I kind of moved away from them for a little bit, but I love them, and I love vintage as a publisher as well. My copy of Mrs Dalloway's Party is also a red spine, so I'm excited to see them all together. Just while I'm talking about the kind of vintage red spine, I also want to share, I've definitely featured this in a lot, but my original copy of Mrs Dalloway, that I will be buried with this book. This book will come with me till the end. Mrs Dalloway was the first Virginia Woolf novel I ever read, and it left a huge mark on my heart. And this is one of the, before they went to the editions like the Night and Day and The Voyage Out with more kind of photographic, they had these really beautiful editions where you've got this silhouette of Virginia Woolf with like a wallpaper pattern, and I really want the other books in this edition, so I may actually try and find them. I don't really like to buy things, like whenever it's a second-hand book or an older edition, I tend to like to just stumble across them rather than like look out for them, but I've never seen them anywhere, and I just think they are so beautiful. And I always loved that it was kind of like almost like Mrs Dalloway, like as if this was Mrs Dalloway kind of going back into the wallpaper, kind of in like a yellow wallpaper kind of thing. And also it's got all my annotations. The whole thing's annotated. In fact, I've had to glue it together. One thing I will do is do a video of all of my different editions of Mrs Dalloway. But yeah, it's, oh my god, it's coming apart even more. So I definitely need to sellotape it. Or just keep it in like a framed, put it in a glass box, I think. Now moving on to my next purchase, and another Virginia Woolf edition collection. I think if you're familiar with my channel, you know this is classic Claire, just buying her favourite books in all of the different editions. As I'm reading the years on my Kindle, I didn't want to commit, so I only have these editions of the Virginia Woolf novels I really love. And because I was reading it, I didn't want to commit to this until I felt that I loved it enough. And while I was in London reading it, I discovered it was time. So I bought the little, what's it called, the Vintage Classics Woolf series by Vintage, with the different kind of like end papers inside. I bought this small edition, and I call these like my pocket Woolf books. I'll get my other ones because I always feel like I need a copy of Virginia Woolf with me at all times. And these little books, I've got A Room of One's Own, and Mrs Dalloway's here. Whoops, can't hold them all. Mrs Dalloway. They're also bright and cheerful as well. This is my favourite cover actually, which is the To the Lighthouse. I think To the Lighthouse and The Years might be my favourite covers. I feel like Mrs Dalloway, I guess it's like floral, but this, The Rain, is just so beautiful. Because so many of Virginia Woolf's books are about walking and about kind of exploring, I feel like you have to have Virginia Woolf in like a portable, like bag-sized book. And these tiny ones, I say they're not that actually, they're not that dissimilar to a normal paperback. They're just like a little bit smaller, but it fits any handbag. And so I've had many days out, in fact when I've taken like A Room of One's Own and walked around London just reading it and almost following, you know, following Mrs Dalloway's walk and following A Room of One's Own. They're the perfect kind of walking companion. And so now I love The Years, I knew that I had to join. So there we are. And now I wanted to talk about The Years in a little bit more depth, but just really give The Years a recommendation to you all, because I feel like it's probably one of the novels, in fact some of her later novels I think really are kind of slightly forgotten about, and so this is my recommendation to read The Years by Virginia Woolf. To go perfectly back to one of the quotes that I mentioned at the beginning of this video about A Room of One's Own being in Fitzroy Square, The Years was intended to be a sequel, an essay novel, which then became The Pargeters and then The Years, but it was intended to follow on from A Room of One's Own, to be about the sexual life of women and to be called The Professions of Women. For years, I put off reading The Years. Virginia Woolf at one point described it as like an odious rice pudding of a book, and in general she saw it as a failure, even though later on she'd say, you know, the failure of the novel was deliberate, and in lots of ways there are failures of communications throughout the entire novel. Because Virginia Woolf hated it so much, even though when Leonard read it, Virginia Woolf wanted to burn the book, and he kept it and read it, and then he was kind of so moved by it, which is exactly how I felt actually reading this book. And I kind of put it off because I didn't want to read something that she wasn't proud of, weirdly, because this kind of relationship that I have with Virginia Woolf. But I was really surprised by it in lots of ways, and I think it's a very different novel to lots of her work, but also covers some of the same important subjects of freedom of women and of history as well. The narrative that we've created over time of history is kind of the big theme, and also it's one of my biggest interests in life about how we document history and why we study history and how we read it. And that really is something that preoccupies The Years as a novel. The Years chronicles the lives and the history of the Pargeter family from the 1800s until present day of the 1930s. And what I find so interesting about Virginia Woolf setting up this narrative in a way that she's never done before is how she looks back at the Victorian era of oppression and then also mirrors it with the kind of what's happening politically in the 1930s. What I really like about Virginia Woolf as a writer is the ability, I guess, to balance out in some ways the Victorian suppression with the fascist oppression. And she does it in a way that it goes back to A Room of One's Own, where there's a description of history and the fact that history isn't the big bits of kings, it's the children going off to school, it's the plates being washed, it's the little acts, the intimacies of our life that actually mark out what history means to someone, and where those big historical events, the political movements, the changing of beliefs come in and actually affect people's lives. And so you have this kind of the intensity of kind of the big things going on in the world, but also the intimacy of the family. And the one reason I like this novel so much is actually the descriptions of moving between that kind of domestic world and the emotion and the fact. And that's something that actually Virginia Woolf really struggled with writing this novel. It was about that balance of fact and feeling, the fact that actually it started off intending to be a novel essay and then ended up being a novel, and balancing how much she wanted to almost preach and be political in this novel whilst also dealing with the interior. And I think the way that she kind of does that a lot is one through the movement of weather. I think the descriptions of nature and beauty and light in this book are as good as they are in Mrs Dalloway or To the Lighthouse, and I wasn't expecting it to be. I don't know why I wasn't expecting it to be as beautifully written, but I think because when the author herself describes it as a rice pudding, your hopes aren't necessarily that high. But I was really struck by the mixing of these two kind of great ideals, and even though she felt that it was a failure, going back to what I said about the failure of communication, there is so much of it that goes on, but ultimately even that becomes a metaphor of the failure of communication both in the Victorian age and also in the politics of the 1930s, where people aren't able to have freedom to actually live their lives. And yeah, it's so good. In 1937, the year The Years was published, Virginia Woolf wrote, "I think action generally unreal. It's the thing we do in the dark that is more real. The thing we do because people's eyes are on us seem to be histrionic, small, boyish. And that's it. It is the things we do in the dark." And I think that is the key to why Virginia Woolf, why I love her writing, and how much of The Years is kind of taken up with that idea of what people do in the dark. There's also a sense of then what becomes of this narrative of history, what is the actual impact on us. The whole thing about this book is the sense of hope that is attached to historical narratives and the movement forwards of history. So I think it's significant that when the book ends, it also ends with a really beautiful description. It says, "The sun had risen, and the sky above the houses wore an extraordinary beauty, simplicity, and peace." So just at the beginning of the book we see the sunset, you then see the sunrise. And life begins again, and it continues. And ultimately, the book is, even though it's full of darkness in lots of points, darkness both in the awareness of kind of a political situation in Europe, but also in anxiety from, the suppression of the Victorian era and the aftermath it has on the family, and the way the characters of the time are suppressed by their gender roles and by who they're supposed to be in society. Virginia Woolf is positive about the movement forward of history, and that as the time keeps coming, I'm getting really bad at describing things, but I actually really like stuff. The movement of time is all about progress, especially in women's rights, and this is a book that really looks at the roles of women, especially after the change to the First World War, and kind of who they've become and have the potential to become in the novel. Like in a lot of Virginia Woolf's writing, the First World War really divides the years and kind of creates that separation between the past and the present, and the kind of past and the future. In the same way To the Lighthouse, where the First World War really kind of, you know, slices like a knife through that novel. You kind of feel that effect so strongly in the years too. When I first went to pick up the years, the thing that was really interesting to me was how Virginia Woolf would deal with Victoriana, with the stuffiness of the Victorian age and the suppression, because the patriarchal Victorian family that ultimately the years is a chronicle of is also like the spectre that haunted Virginia Woolf, all of her writing, and you can really feel that in the years. There's a few moments in her letters, I think, where she refers to her father, Leslie Stephen, and says like it would have been his birthday, his life would have ended mine. The idea of like my life would have been incompatible with him existing, and that is really his kind of symbol of the Victorian era, that way of life. If that had survived, I could never have done what I've done, which is that kind of feeling is at the heart of the novel. The book is also playful, and I think that's one thing I think people forget about Virginia Woolf writing, that she's also a really playful writer. And what I loved was, you know, Victorians love a deathbed scene, and there's a really kind of prolonged deathbed scene. There's a constant deathbed scene with the character's mother, Rose Parchester, who is constantly dying and just kind of won't make up her mind for the very first section, tiny section of the novel about dying. And it's this idea of kind of them representing their death, representing the beginning of a new era. And when the mother dies, it kind of is like the first crack that appears. But it isn't until Colonel Parchester dies, very much like Virginia Woolf's kind of own family setup, that the characters in the novel are allowed to feel a bit of freedom from being certain characters, like the caretaker. And his death marks the ending of the Victorian era and onto the progress that will happen later in the novel. I wouldn't ever sit down and say that The Years is Virginia Woolf's best novel, or even my favourite novel. But when she was kind of writing about it and talking about it afterwards, she described it as such a failure, not only of the novel itself, but of a failure of her as a writer, and her whole existence had kind of wrapped up in the failure of this novel. And there's one point when she says that, you know, it's my failure as a writer. I'm at the end point of myself as a writer and as a being, that you realise actually that so much of Virginia Woolf that is in all of her novels just all culminates in The Years. And I actually think it's a really powerful, and even though it isn't the essay novel that she would have intended, it has so much of that integrity and that heart, and so much of the beautiful descriptions that makes it a novel that I think if you haven't read and you feel like you've read a lot of Virginia Woolf, but this is the one that you haven't read yet, I think you'd be really missing out if you kind of carried on with the years of your life without reading The Years. And, you know, it's problematic, I'm not going to lie, but I definitely think it's a bit better, even though I love a rice pudding. It's just a really good rice pudding. Thank you so much for joining me on my little walk in London and in my love letter to Virginia Woolf at the very end. If you are here with me now, please leave a clock emoji to symbolise the passing of time, the passing of the years, if you will. To end this video, I thought I'd actually leave you with a quote from a different Virginia Woolf novel, which is To the Lighthouse, because I feel like the last kind of line of To the Lighthouse sums up what I think Virginia Woolf wanted to do in The Years, and that I actually think she did achieve. With a sudden intensity, as if she saw it clear for a second, she drew a line there, in the centre. It was done, it was finished. Yes, she thought, laying down her brush in extreme fatigue, I have had my vision. The end.